He had done everything right. In the summer of 1661, Nicolas Fouquet, the finance minister of France, invited his king to a party. The estate was called Vaux-le-Vicomte. Fouquet had spent years, and a fortune most people could not imagine, building it. Fountains that moved on command, gardens laid out like a mathematical proof, a fireworks display timed to the second. He hired the best architect in France, the best gardener, the best playwright, Molière, wrote a piece for the evening. Everyone who mattered was there. And at the center of it, Fouquet had arranged for the king himself, 22-year-old Louis XIV, to be the guest of honor. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested. He spent the rest of his life in prison, and historians still argue over exactly which of his crimes mattered most. The money he may have embezzled, the fortress he'd quietly fortified, the ambition his enemies whispered about. But the party at Vaux is the detail that survives. Louis walked through gardens more magnificent than his own, hosted by a subject wealthier in that moment than his king. Within a month, Louis began building Versailles, partly, some historians believe, to make sure nobody would ever again outdo him like that. Fouquet wasn't punished for failing the king. He was punished for succeeding too visibly, in a room where only one person was supposed to shine. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is right there for you. I read all of them, and it always surprises me how far this channel reaches. That's the strange arithmetic at the center of power. Being competent doesn't protect you. Being right doesn't protect you. Sometimes, the very thing you're proudest of is the thing that gets you destroyed. Because power isn't only about what you accomplish. It's about how your accomplishment makes the person above you feel. In 1998, a former advertising strategist named Robert Greene published a book trying to map this arithmetic across 500 years of history. The 48 Laws of Power pulled from war rooms, royal courts, con artists, revolutionaries, and businessmen, and organized what it found into 48 recurring patterns. These aren't laws in the scientific sense. Nobody has proven that concealing your intentions always works, and history is full of people who broke every one of these rules and still ended up remembered as great. Several of the laws even contradict each other. One tells you to attract attention. Another tells you to master the art of disappearing. That's not a flaw in the framework. It's a sign that power isn't a formula. It's a set of pressures that different people, in different situations, have learned to read in different ways. What we're going to do is walk through those 48 patterns, not as instructions, but as a map of how humans have fought for status, protected it, lost it, and occasionally destroyed themselves, trying to keep it. Some of what follows describes admirable discipline. Some of it describes manipulation. You should learn to recognize, specifically, so it can't be used on you. By the end, the question won't be whether these laws are true. It will be what kind of power is actually worth having. Movement 1, surviving a world of ego. Before the first law, it's worth sitting with something uncomfortable. The people at the top of a hierarchy are rarely afraid of the people beneath them who are incompetent. Incompetence is manageable. It's brilliance that unsettles a fragile ruler, because brilliance is a mirror, and not every ruler likes what it shows them. Admiration and resentment can occupy the same person, sometimes in the same week. The 8 laws that follow are mostly about managing that fact before it manages you. Never outshine the master. Fouquet's story already told you the shape of this law. It's worth adding one more piece. Fouquet wasn't a fool. He understood court politics well enough to survive in it for years. What he misjudged wasn't the danger of ambition. It was the danger of a single evening. He didn't need to eclipse Louis for the rest of his life. He needed to eclipse him for one night, in front of everyone whose opinion Louis cared about, and that was enough. This is a strange kind of vulnerability. A person can be careful for years and undone by a moment they didn't even register as risky. Psychologists sometimes describe something related to this as status anxiety, the discomfort a person feels not when their position is objectively threatened, but when it's threatened in front of an audience. A private compliment rarely stings a boss the way a public one does, aimed at someone else, in a meeting the boss also attended. It shows up now in far smaller rooms than palaces. An employee who solves a problem their manager missed and explains it at length in front of the team learns this the hard way. Not because the solution was wrong, but because the moment made someone else look smaller in front of people whose respect mattered to them. None of this means competence should be hidden. It means competence delivered without regard for who else is in the room is a different act than competence delivered with it. The line between the two isn't always obvious until you've crossed it. And by then, like Fouquet, you may already be building the wrong kind of reputation. Law 2. Never trust friends too much, use enemies. In the year 866, the Byzantine Emperor Michael III had a friend. Basil was a horse tamer from a poor family, brought into the palace initially for his physical strength. Michael liked him, trusted him, elevated him, first as a companion, then as chamberlain, and eventually, extraordinarily, as co-emperor, crowned alongside Michael himself. Basil owed his entire rise to that friendship. He had no rival claim to the throne, no army, no faction of his own, nothing except Michael's affection. In September of 867, Basil had Michael murdered in his bedroom and took the throne alone. Historians still debate exactly what drove Basil. Fear that his own position was becoming unstable as Michael's favor shifted towards someone else, ambition that had simply grown past what friendship could satisfy, or some mixture the sources don't fully preserve. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. The person with the most access, the most trust, and the least to prove was the one who ended Michael's reign. There's a reason this pattern recurs. A rival you've never trusted has to work to get close to you, and you watch them do it. A friend is already inside the walls. They don't need to defeat your defenses because you never raised any against them in the first place. This doesn't mean friendship is a liability to be managed like a threat. That reading turns every relationship into a transaction, and a life built that way tends to end up isolated rather than secure. It means unconditional trust, extended without limit or scrutiny, removes the one thing that might have caught a betrayal early, the habit of paying attention. Law 3. Conceal your intentions. In 1220, the armies of Genghis Khan approached a fortified position and did something that looked, to the defenders watching from the walls, like defeat. They broke formation. They retreated in apparent disorder, abandoning supplies as they went. It was a tactic the Mongols used with enough consistency across their campaigns that historians now treat it as a signature, not a single trick but a doctrine. Commanders would feign panic, feign a rout, sometimes for days at a stretch, luring a confident enemy into a pursuit that stretched their formation thin and exhausted their horses. Then the retreat would stop being a retreat. What made it effective wasn't cunning in the abstract. It was that the Mongols understood exactly what a winning army wants to believe. A force that thinks it's chasing a broken enemy stops behaving like a force under threat. It behaves like a force claiming a prize. That shift in posture from caution to appetite is what the concealment was designed to produce. Confirmation bias is the closest psychological description available. Once a person believes they're winning, new information gets filtered to confirm it rather than question it. A disorganized retreat looks like proof of victory to someone already expecting one. The danger runs in both directions, though. Concealment bought this way is a resource, not a habit-free tool. A commander, or a negotiator, or a colleague who is known for never showing their real position eventually trains everyone around them to distrust everything they say, including the times they're being straightforward. Mystery has a shelf life. Used constantly, it stops looking like strategy and starts looking like dishonesty with better branding. Law 4. Always say less than necessary. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, was famous for something almost nobody else in politics wanted to be famous for: how little he said. The nickname Silent Cal wasn't an exaggeration invented later. Contemporaries described dinners where he sat through entire courses without volunteering a sentence, letting other guests fill the silence, sometimes past the point of visible discomfort. There's a widely repeated story about a woman at a dinner telling him she'd bet she could get him to say more than 2 words, and Coolidge's reply being simply, "You lose." This story is charming enough that its authenticity is disputed by some biographers, but the reputation it reflects wasn't invented. It was earned over an entire public career. What's easy to miss is that this wasn't shyness functioning as a handicap. It became a political asset. Reporters and opponents alike found themselves guessing at his positions, filling his silences with their own assumptions, occasionally overestimating a caution he didn't necessarily feel. A person who talks constantly gives you a complete inventory of what they think. A person who says little gives you fragments, and most people, uncomfortable with fragments, will construct something more impressive out of them than the truth might have been. There's an obvious cost the law doesn't advertise. Silence read as wisdom in one context can read as evasiveness or coldness or simple unpreparedness in another. A job candidate who says too little in an interview isn't building mystique. They're leaving a blank the interviewer fills with doubt instead of respect. The advantage depends entirely on whether the audience is inclined to fill the silence generously. Coolidge had that. Not everyone does. Law 5. Guard your reputation. In 1895, Oscar Wilde was the most celebrated playwright in London. Within 4 months, he was in prison. The public collapse didn't happen gradually. Wilde had sued the Marquess of Queensberry for libel, confident the case would vindicate him, and the defense instead produced evidence that turned the trial against Wilde himself, leading to his own prosecution under the era's laws criminalizing homosexuality. What had been, weeks earlier, celebrated wit and personal charisma became, almost overnight, the exact material used to convict him. His plays were pulled from London stages within days of the verdict. Friends who had filled his dinner parties stopped acknowledging him in public. The speed is the part worth sitting with. A reputation built over 2 decades of celebrated work took less than a season to come apart once it became a target. And once it started coming apart, the momentum of the collapse didn't require new evidence. It only required people already primed to believe the worst. This is closer to how reputation actually functions than most people assume day to day. It behaves less like a bank account, where you draw down slowly from a large balance, and more like a dam. It holds until it doesn't, and then it releases everything at once. None of this is an argument that reputation should be managed through concealment or dishonesty. A life spent hiding the truth to protect an image is its own kind of prison, arguably closer to the one Wilde eventually served. But it is an argument that a reputation, once it becomes public property, stops being something only its owner controls. Wilde didn't lose his reputation because his talent disappeared. He lost it because a courtroom decided what his life meant, and after that, evidence stopped being the thing that mattered most. Law 6. Court attention at all costs. Long before viral marketing had a name, Phineas Taylor Barnum understood something about attention that most of his competitors didn't. It doesn't have to be favorable to be valuable. Barnum built his American Museum in New York into one of the most visited attractions in the country during the 1840s and 50s, and he did it partly through exhibits that provoked argument as much as wonder. The authenticity of the Fiji mermaid was disputed practically from the day it went on display, and Barnum let the dispute run rather than settling it. Controversy drove foot traffic. Skeptics came to debunk the exhibit and paid admission to do it, which meant the argument itself became part of the business model. He wasn't indifferent to being called a fraud. He seemed to understand that indifference from the public was the only outcome actually worth fearing. A crowd arguing about whether something is real is still a crowd. A crowd that has stopped talking about you at all has moved on to someone else's museum. This maps onto something researchers now call the attention economy, though the underlying mechanism predates the phrase by a century and a half. Outrage and admiration both produce engagement. Indifference produces neither. A modern equivalent shows up constantly online, where a deliberately provocative post generates more replies, including angry ones, than a careful, uncontroversial one. And the algorithm rewarding that engagement doesn't distinguish between the two kinds of attention. The limitation is straightforward enough that it barely needs stating. Attention captured through controversy is attention, not trust. Barnum built an entertainment empire on it. A doctor, a judge, or anyone whose actual authority depends on being believed rather than merely noticed is playing a different game. And confusing the two has ended careers that a showman's instincts would have survived easily. Law 7. Get others to do the work, take the credit. In 1953, a paper appeared in the journal Nature announcing the double helix structure of DNA, authored by James Watson and Francis Crick. Their model depended, in ways that weren't fully disclosed to the public at the time, on X-ray diffraction images produced by Rosalind Franklin, a chemist working at King's College London. One image in particular, known later as Photograph 51, made largely by Franklin's PhD student Raymond Gosling under her supervision, was shown to Watson without Franklin's knowledge or consent by a colleague who had access to her unpublished data. Watson later acknowledged in his own memoir how directly that image shaped the model he and Crick went on to publish. Franklin died in 1958, 4 years before the Nobel Prize for the discovery was awarded to Watson, Crick, and Maurice Wilkins. Nobel rules don't allow posthumous awards, so the question of what recognition she might have received had she lived was never formally tested. But the pattern of the story doesn't need that question answered to make its point. Her data reached the men whose names became attached to the discovery, and the credit followed the names, not the data. This isn't a story about theft in a legal sense. The historical record is more tangled than that, and historians of science still debate exactly how much Franklin herself might have concluded had she had more time. But it's a clean illustration of something that recurs constantly in less dramatic settings. Credit tends to attach to whoever is positioned to present the conclusion, not necessarily to whoever produced the material the conclusion depended on. In an office, it looks smaller and happens faster. Someone spends a weekend building the analysis behind a proposal. Someone else presents it Monday morning, fields the questions, and absorbs the praise. The work and the credit have quietly become two different people's property, and by the time anyone notices, the meeting has already ended. Law 8. Make others come to you. Rome, 217 BC. Hannibal's army had just destroyed a Roman force at Lake Trasimene, and the Republic, in a panic, appointed a dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus to deal with him. Fabius did something that Roman soldiers and senators alike found almost unbearable to watch. Nothing. He refused to meet Hannibal in open battle. He shadowed the Carthaginian army through Italy, harassing its supply lines, staying always just out of range of a decisive engagement, and letting Hannibal's forces wear down in hostile territory, far from home, while Rome's own strength quietly recovered. His countrymen mocked him for it. The nickname that survives, Cunctator, the Delayer, was not originally meant as a compliment. Rome wanted a hero who would meet the invader and win. What it got, at least at first, was a general who seemed to be avoiding the fight entirely. Fabius understood something his critics didn't want to hear. Hannibal was winning every battle he was offered, which meant offering him battles was losing strategy no matter how satisfying it felt. The war Rome could actually win was the one where Hannibal was forced to operate on unfamiliar ground, without reinforcement, for years, waiting for an opening that Fabius simply refused to give him. It took Rome most of a generation, and other generals besides Fabius, to finally defeat Hannibal. The strategy that carries his name wasn't a complete war plan so much as a way of surviving the years when Rome couldn't yet win outright. But the core insight has outlasted this specific war. The side forced to initiate, forced to travel, forced to chase, is very often negotiating or fighting from a position weaker than it looks. Waiting isn't always passive. Sometimes it's the only move that doesn't hand the other side exactly what they came for. Rome eventually stopped waiting. That's where the next stretch of this story begins. Movement 2. Control, distance, and dependence. Not all control looks like force, and most of it isn't. A person can be controlled by what they need, what they don't know, and who they've allowed themselves to depend on, often without ever being threatened directly. The 8 laws in this section are mostly about that quieter machinery, and about where it stops being leadership and starts being something closer to exploitation. Law 9, win through actions, never argument. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping was trying to convince a country that had spent 30 years treating market activity as ideologically dangerous to allow some of it back. He didn't win that argument in the Politburo, he won it in Shenzhen. Deng designated a handful of coastal areas as special economic zones, where foreign investment, private enterprise, and market pricing would be allowed to operate quietly, on a limited scale, without first securing full ideological agreement from the party's conservative wing. Shenzhen went from a fishing town to a manufacturing center within a few years, visibly, measurably, in a way that no speech could have produced. Other zones followed. So did results other officials could travel to and see for themselves. The phrase attributed to Deng, that it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice, captures the logic better than any formal policy paper could have. He wasn't trying to defeat the argument that markets were dangerous. He was trying to make the argument irrelevant by producing an outcome the argument couldn't explain away. This works because people update more slowly in response to being told they're wrong than in response to watching something succeed in front of them. A rebuttal invites a counter-rebuttal. A result sitting on a table doesn't argue back. It's not a universal shortcut. A demonstration only persuades an audience willing to look at it honestly, and a rival determined to protect their position can simply refuse to credit what they're seeing or attribute the result to something other than the choice that produced it. Deng's zones worked partly because their success was too large and too visible to dismiss. Smaller demonstrations don't always get that benefit of the doubt. Law 10. Infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias and heir to the Spanish throne, was by most contemporary accounts a deeply troubled young man, impulsive, prone to violent outbursts, and increasingly erratic through his early 20s. In 1568, his father Philip II had him confined to his rooms. 6 months later, Don Carlos was dead, in circumstances that were never fully explained, and became the subject of speculation for centuries afterward. What's less discussed than the mystery of his death is the years before it, the way his instability became a factor other people at court had to plan around. Alliances shifted depending on who was or wasn't willing to be associated with him. Ambassadors reported on his condition as a matter of state importance, because an unstable heir wasn't a private family matter in a monarchy. It was a variable that could destabilize succession, foreign relationships, and the confidence of allies watching from outside Spain's borders. There's something almost clinical in how deliberately the Spanish court began managing distance from Don Carlos as his behavior worsened. Not out of cruelty in most accounts, but out of a recognition that his volatility was contagious in a specific sense. It made everyone near him a subject of the same suspicion and instability people already associated with him. This isn't a tidy psychological principle so much as an observation about proximity. People are judged partly by association, and an organization, court, or friend group under strain will often protect itself by quietly distancing itself from whoever seems to be the source of the strain, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. The uncomfortable edge of this law is how easily it slides into something uglier. Abandoning someone during a genuine crisis, mistaking a person's suffering for a threat to be managed rather than a situation to be helped through. The line between guarding your stability and abandoning someone who needs you isn't always where self-interest wants it to be. Law 11. Learn to keep people dependent. The Tianqi emperor, who ruled Ming China from 1620, was reportedly far more interested in carpentry than in governing, and the court eunuch Wei Zhongxian made sure that interest was never inconvenienced. Wei controlled what reached the emperor's desk. He controlled who received an audience and who didn't. Over the course of the 1620s, he built a position of effective control over the Ming bureaucracy that had almost nothing to do with any formal title he held, and almost everything to do with the fact that the one person whose authority outranked his had made himself easy to keep occupied elsewhere. Officials who wanted anything from the throne learned quickly that the fastest route ran through Wei's office, not the emperor's. That single fact, that access itself had become something only one person could grant, gave Wei power that rivaled or exceeded many nominally more senior officials. And it lasted for as long as the emperor remained content not to look too closely at what was happening around him. Wei's downfall came fast once the next emperor took the throne in 1627 and had no reason to protect an arrangement he hadn't built. Wei was stripped of his position within months and died shortly after, by most accounts by his own hand, rather than face what was coming. The mechanism here is straightforward. A person who controls access, information, or a needed resource accumulates influence that has nothing to do with formal rank. But the same story shows the limitation as clearly as the advantage. Dependence built on one person's willful negligence is only as secure as that negligence. The moment the person at the top stops being incurious or is replaced by someone who isn't, the entire structure can collapse in weeks. Law 12. used selective honesty to disarm. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814, the great powers of Europe gathered to redraw the map after Napoleon's defeat, and France, the country that had just spent over a decade at war with most of the room, was represented by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. By any reasonable measure, France should have had almost no leverage at that table. Talleyrand's approach wasn't to deny this. It was closer to the opposite. He conceded openly, in front of the assembled powers, that France had been the aggressor, that its recent conduct had earned distrust, and that its interests should be weighed accordingly. Having granted the room that concession, he then argued, credibly, because he just demonstrated he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, that a stable, restored, moderate France served everyone's interests better than a France left crippled or partitioned to satisfy old grievances. It worked. France ended up a full participant in negotiations that, by the raw arithmetic of who had won the war, it had no obvious right to influence. Selective honesty functions because most negotiating parties expect a defeated or weakened side to minimize, deflect, or plead. A concession offered before it's extracted reads as a different kind of signal entirely. Evidence, whether accurate or not, that whatever comes next in the conversation can be trusted. The tactic depends on the concession being real enough to register as costly. A hollow admission, offered with nothing behind it, doesn't disarm anyone. It just confirms the suspicion it was meant to dissolve. Talleyrand's credibility came from conceding something true and painful. A smaller, safer confession wouldn't have bought him the same room. Law 13, appeal to self-interest, not mercy. By early 1776, Benjamin Franklin was trying to convince the government of France to support a rebellion against Britain, a cause France had no obligation to care about and every reason to view cautiously, given the risk of provoking a war of its own. Franklin's case in Paris wasn't built primarily on sympathy for colonial grievance, though that argument existed too. It was built on the observation, made repeatedly in different forms across years of diplomacy, that a weakened Britain served French interests directly. France and Britain had been rivals for the better part of a century, across multiple continents and wars. An independent America wasn't a favor Franklin was asking France to grant out of principle. It was a strategic opportunity dressed, when useful, in the language of principle. France eventually committed money, then arms, then its navy, support that proved decisive at Yorktown in 1781. Historians still debate how much of that outcome traces to Franklin's specific diplomatic skill versus France's own strategic calculations, which existed independently of anything he said. But Franklin's approach, treating French self-interest as the argument worth making, rather than treating American virtue as something France should feel obligated to reward, matched what French ministers were already inclined to hear. The pattern generalizes past diplomacy easily enough. A plea for mercy asks someone to act against their own interest out of generosity, which is a request most people, most of the time, quietly resist even when they don't say so. An appeal to self-interest asks for nothing of the kind. It offers a reason the other party would have acted on anyway, once they can see it clearly. Law 14, pose as a friend, work as a spy. Kim Philby spent nearly 3 decades as one of the most trusted officers in British intelligence, rising to senior positions within MI6, while secretly working for Soviet intelligence for the entire span of that career. He wasn't merely tolerated inside British intelligence, he was liked. Colleagues described him as charming, capable, and, this detail matters more than it might seem to, reliably one of them, a product of the same universities and social world as the men he worked alongside. That familiarity was the access. Philby wasn't trying to break into British intelligence from outside. He was already inside it. Trusted precisely because nobody in that world seriously questioned whether one of their own could be working for the other side. He was finally exposed and defected to Moscow in 1963, by which point the damage attributed to his years of access, operations compromised, agents identified, and in some cases executed, had already been done, and for the most part couldn't be undone. The mechanism is almost too simple to need explaining. Trust is a form of reduced scrutiny, and reduced scrutiny is exactly what espionage, manipulation, and betrayal all require to function. This is worth naming plainly as a warning rather than a technique. The lesson for most people isn't how to run an operation like Philby's. It's the recognition that the people positioned to do the most damage to you are rarely strangers. They're the ones you've already stopped checking. Law 15. Crush your enemy totally. Carthage lost the Second Punic War in 202 BC, the one Hannibal had spent over a decade fighting and very nearly won. Rome imposed harsh terms: reparations, a diminished fleet, restrictions on Carthage's ability to wage war without Roman permission. But Carthage itself was left standing. It rebuilt. Within half a century, Carthaginian trade and prosperity had recovered enough that Roman senators, led by Cato the Elder, began ending every speech in the Senate, regardless of the speech's actual subject, with the same closing line: Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome went to war a third time, and this time didn't stop at defeat. Carthage was razed. Its population was killed or enslaved. The site, by later legend, was sown with salt, a detail most modern historians now treat as later embellishment rather than established fact, though the destruction itself is not in dispute. The lesson Rome drew from the gap between the Second War and the Third wasn't subtle. An enemy defeated but left intact remains an enemy, with time, motive, and eventually the means to try again. It's a brutal principle, and applying it outside actual warfare requires real caution. Most rivalries, in business or politics or ordinary life, aren't wars, and treating them as though total destruction of an opponent is the only safe outcome tends to manufacture far more enemies than it eliminates. But the underlying observation still holds in smaller settings. A defeated rival who still has resources, reputation, and reason for grievance rarely stays defeated forever. The Second Punic War didn't end the conflict between Rome and Carthage. It postponed it. Law 16. Use absence to increase respect. In January 1946, Charles de Gaulle resigned as head of France's provisional government, at the height of his influence as the man most associated with French liberation, and walked away from politics entirely. He spent the next 12 years mostly out of office, writing memoirs, watching from a distance as the Fourth Republic cycled through one unstable government after another. By 1958, with France paralyzed by the Algerian crisis and the Fourth Republic collapsing, the political establishment that had spent over a decade without him turned, in effect, back to him, inviting de Gaulle to return and form a new government, which became the foundation of the Fifth Republic, with de Gaulle as its first president. 12 years is a long time for a withdrawal to still be read as strategic rather than simply finished. What's harder to say with certainty is how much of de Gaulle's return was the result of calculated absence, and how much was simply that France, in crisis, ran out of other options and rediscovered a man who happened to still be available. Both readings appear in different historians, accounts, and the truth is probably some mixture the record doesn't settle cleanly. What the story does illustrate, regardless of how deliberate de Gaulle's 12 years away actually were, is how differently a return reads after absence compared to a presence that never left. A leader who never steps back is measured every single day against whatever is happening that day. A leader who disappears and returns is measured against the vacuum they left behind. And a vacuum, especially during a crisis, tends to flatter whoever eventually fills it. But a vacuum isn't only filled by whoever eventually steps into it. In the meantime, it's filled by rumor, by fear, by whatever story people tell themselves when the truth isn't available. What happens next depends less on what a person does than on what everyone around them believes they might do. Movement 3. Perception becomes reality. Somewhere past a certain amount of power, the image starts doing work the person can't do directly. What people believe about a leader, that they're unpredictable, that they're untouchable, that they can't be read, starts functioning almost like a second set of hands. The 8 laws in this section are about building that image. They're also about what happens when the image stops being something a person controls and starts controlling them instead. Law 17. Keep others in suspended terror. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. Ivan IV of Russia, remembered by history as Ivan the Terrible, created, in 1565, a private state within his own state. He called it the Oprichnina, a territory and a personal guard answerable to him alone, operating outside the normal legal and administrative structures of Russia, with the explicit purpose of identifying and destroying anyone even suspected of disloyalty. The oprichniki rode with dogs, heads, and brooms tied to their saddles, a visual signal that they hunted and swept away traitors, and their targets were rarely announced in advance. A noble family in favor one season could be executed the next, sometimes for reasons that were never made public even to the rest of the court. Nobody could predict who was next, which meant nobody could plan a rebellion with confidence, because any conspirator recruited today might be the one denouncing you to Ivan tomorrow, whether out of genuine loyalty or simple fear. That unpredictability was the entire mechanism. A ruler whose punishments follow a knowable logic can be worked around. Avoid the specific behavior that triggers punishment, and you're safe. A ruler whose punishments follow no visible logic at all forces everyone into constant, exhausting vigilance, because there's no rule to follow that guarantees safety. The cost, in Ivan's case, is part of the same history. The oprichnina devastated the Russian nobility and the economy along with it, and by the time Ivan died in 1584, Russia was weakened enough by the years of internal terror that it fell into a period of chaos and dynastic crisis historians call the Time of Troubles. Unpredictability kept enemies off balance. It also meant nobody around Ivan, including people who might otherwise have served him well, could ever fully trust that today's loyalty would be enough tomorrow. Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. By the late 1980s, Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled Romania for over 2 decades, largely from behind a wall of security services, curated public appearances, and information filtered so thoroughly by his own apparatus that historians studying the period have described him as having lost any accurate sense of how his population actually felt about him. On December 21, 1989, he held a public rally in Bucharest meant to demonstrate popular support, the kind of staged event that had worked for him many times before. Partway through his speech, broadcast live on state television, the crowd began jeering. Ceausescu's expression of confusion, caught on camera in front of the entire country, has become one of the defining images of the collapse of Eastern European communism, because it captured in real time a leader discovering that the reality he'd been told about his own country wasn't the one that existed. 4 days later, he and his wife were executed following a brief trial. The isolation that had protected Ceausescu from criticism for over 20 years turned out to be the same isolation that left him with no accurate information when it mattered most. A ruler surrounded only by people whose careers depend on telling him what he wants to hear eventually stops receiving warnings at all. Not because the warnings don't exist, but because nobody left in the room is willing to be the one who delivers them. This isn't only a lesson about dictators. Isolation from dissenting opinion produces the same blindness at smaller scales. An executive who has quietly stopped hearing bad news because the last person who delivered it was pushed out. A public figure surrounded entirely by people who agree with them. The fortress keeps danger out. It also keeps the truth from getting in. Law 19. Know who you're dealing with. Do not offend the wrong person. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate with Adolf Hitler over the fate of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, and returned believing he had secured, in his own words, peace for our time. Chamberlain's approach rested on an assumption that turned out to be badly mistaken, that Hitler's demands, however alarming, were fundamentally limited and negotiable, that a reasonable concession, offered in good faith, would satisfy him and preserve the peace. Chamberlain was negotiating with the tools of ordinary diplomacy: patience, compromise, an assumption of shared interest in avoiding catastrophe applied to someone who did not share that interest at all. Less than a year later, Germany invaded Poland, and the war Chamberlain had believed he'd prevented began anyway. Winston Churchill, who had been warning for years that Hitler's ambitions extended well past the Sudetenland, is often credited with reading the situation correctly where Chamberlain didn't. Though it's worth noting Churchill's warnings were largely dismissed at the time, and hindsight makes his judgment look more certain in retrospect than it appeared to most of his contemporaries in 1938. What Chamberlain's failure illustrates isn't a simple mistake in tactics. It's a mismatch between the strategy chosen and the actual nature of the person it was aimed at. Concession works on an opponent whose demands are genuinely limited. It doesn't work on one who reads every concession as evidence that further demands will also succeed. Misjudging which kind of opponent you're facing isn't a minor miscalculation. Chamberlain's case is a reminder that it can be the single most consequential decision in the entire negotiation. Law 20, do not commit to anyone. Elizabeth I of England spent 45 years as queen and never married. The refusal wasn't personal indecision drawn out for decades. It was, by most historians' reading, a deliberate policy. Elizabeth entertained marriage proposals and courtships from a long list of foreign princes and domestic nobles. The Duke of Anjou, the Earl of Leicester, Philip II of Spain earlier in her reign, and kept nearly all of them alive as possibilities for years at a time without ever committing to one. Each unresolved courtship was leverage. A marriage to a French prince kept France invested in staying friendly, without ever actually surrendering England's independence to French interests. The same calculation applied to Spanish, and later other, suitors. The moment Elizabeth married any one of them, she would have bound England's foreign policy to that alliance and made herself and her country a target for everyone left out of it. Staying uncommitted meant staying useful, and being useful to everyone at once turned out to be a more durable position than being loyal to any one of them. The cost of this strategy is easy to underestimate because Elizabeth managed it unusually well for an unusually long time. Refusing every alliance also means refusing every alliance's protection. Elizabeth's England faced real threats, including the Spanish Armada in 1588, without the guaranteed backing a marriage pact might have provided. Non-commitment kept her free. It also meant she carried the full weight of every crisis without a partner obligated to share it. Law 21. Play a sucker to catch a sucker, seem dumber than your mark. In 1925, a con artist named Victor Lustig convinced a group of Parisian scrap metal dealers that the French government had secretly decided to demolish the Eiffel Tower and was quietly soliciting bids for the metal. The scheme worked partly because of forged government stationery and a convincing performance as a minor official, but the crucial detail is who Lustig chose as his marks. He selected dealers he judged correctly to be willing to pay a bribe to secure the contract without asking too many questions, because dealers already comfortable operating that way wouldn't report the arrangement to authorities even after realizing they'd been cheated, out of embarrassment at their own willingness to pay the bribe in the first place. One dealer, André Poisson, paid Lustig a substantial sum for both the contract and a discreet bribe on top of it. And when he discovered the fraud, said nothing to police, exactly as Lustig had gambled, he wouldn't. Lustig reportedly ran the same scheme a second time months later, confident that word of the first fraud hadn't spread, precisely because his victim's own guilt had kept it quiet. The tactic depends on a specific and somewhat uncomfortable psychological mechanism. A mark who believes they're the one getting away with something is far less likely to examine the offer critically, and far less likely to report being cheated once they discover it, because doing so means admitting what they were trying to get away with. Lustig wasn't exploiting naivete. He was exploiting other people's own willingness to cut corners. It's worth being direct about what this law actually describes. A mechanism for fraud, built specifically around a victim's own dishonesty as cover. Understanding how it works is protective. Recognizing the shape of an offer that seems built to make you complicit rather than merely persuaded is a genuine warning sign worth knowing. It isn't a technique to admire. Law 22. Use the surrender tactic, transform weakness into power. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese public for the first time, announcing Japan's surrender in language so formal and indirect that many listeners reportedly weren't certain, at first, what they'd just heard. The surrender itself was unconditional in military terms, but the negotiations preceding it, conducted through diplomatic channels in the days before the broadcast, focused heavily on one specific question: whether the emperor himself would be permitted to remain as a symbolic figure under the post-war occupation, rather than being removed or tried. The Allied response left the matter deliberately ambiguous, and General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the occupation, ultimately chose to preserve the imperial institution, judging, correctly, that a Japan allowed to keep its emperor as a unifying symbol would be easier to govern and rebuild than a Japan whose entire symbolic order had been dismantled along with its military. Hirohito went from head of a defeated empire to a constitutional ceremonial monarch who remained on the throne for another 44 years, dying in 1989. Having presided, in name if not in real political power, over one of the most successful national reconstructions in modern history. Total defeat didn't have to mean total removal. The surrender, handled carefully, preserved something the war itself had seemed certain to destroy. This is a different lesson than the raw defiance the earlier laws in this documentary have mostly explored. Sometimes the position that survives isn't the one that fought hardest, but the one that recognized exactly which parts of a collapse were negotiable and which weren't. Law 23. Concentrate your forces. Andrew Carnegie built the largest steel company in the United States by refusing, for most of his career, to build much of anything else. While rival industrialists of the Gilded Age diversified aggressively, railroads investing in mining, mining companies investing in shipping, fortunes spread thin across whatever opportunity presented itself. Carnegie kept almost the entirety of his capital and attention inside steel, and increasingly inside the specific technologies that made his mills more efficient than anyone else's. He was among the earliest American industrialists to fully commit to the Bessemer process, and he reinvested profits back into plant efficiency and vertical integration, owning the mines that fed the mills, the railroads that moved the ore, rather than spreading his fortune into unrelated ventures the way many of his contemporaries did. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than the entire steel industry of Great Britain, a country that had industrialized a generation earlier. When Carnegie sold the company to J.P. Morgan in 1901, forming what became U.S. Steel, the sale price, roughly $480 million, reflected a business built almost entirely on refusing to be anything other than what it already did best. The logic is simple to state and hard to practice. Because diversification feels like safety, even when it's diluting an advantage that concentration would have sharpened instead. A force, a company, or a career spread across many fronts is rarely dominant on any single one of them. Carnegie's fortune came from being unusually willing to say no to opportunities that would have pulled his attention and his capital away from the one thing he'd already proven he could do better than anyone else. Law 24. Play the perfect courtier. Anastas Mikoyan held senior positions in the Soviet government from the early 1920s under Lenin through the mid-1960s under Brezhnev, surviving, in that span, the purges of the 1930s, the Second World War, the death of Stalin, the brief rise and fall of Beria, and the ousting of Khrushchev, without ever himself being purged, imprisoned, or executed. A joke that circulated in Soviet political circles captured the scale of the achievement better than any formal biography, that Mikoyan had managed to walk from Ilyich to Ilyich, from Lenin to Brezhnev, both of whom shared the patronymic Ilyich, without being caught in a downpour. In an era when proximity to power in the Soviet Union carried an unusually high mortality rate, Mikoyan's specific skill wasn't ideological brilliance or personal charisma in the way Stalin or Khrushchev commanded attention. It was an almost unmatched sense of exactly how much loyalty each successive leader required, exactly when to speak and when not to, and exactly which factional fights were worth being visibly part of, and which ones demanded invisibility. He wasn't merely passive. Mikoyan played meaningful roles in real policy, including, later in his career, in de-escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the through line across 4 decades and 4 very different leaders was an unusual discipline about self-presentation, never appearing to be anyone's rival, never appearing indispensable enough to threaten, never appearing dispensable enough to be safely removed. The skill this describes is genuinely difficult to separate from simple survival instinct, and it raises its own quiet question. A courtier this careful across this many regimes wasn't just protecting themselves from a specific danger. They were making an entire career out of never fully revealing what they actually believed, which means, by the end of it, verifying what Mikoyan himself thought about the system he served for over 40 years is close to impossible. The perfect courtier survives. What he loses, along the way, is the version of himself that anyone else can ever fully know. Some people decide that same trade is worth making more than once, not just managing how they're perceived in a single court, but rebuilding who they are entirely, sometimes more than one time in a single life. Movement 4. Creating an identity. There's a difference between managing how a moment looks and constructing an identity meant to outlast every individual moment. A public self built deliberately that can survive scrutiny, disappointment, even collapse and rebuilding. The 8 laws in this section trace that difference, and the point at which building an identity slides into something closer to performing one or lying about one. Law 25. Recreate yourself. Malcolm Little was born in Omaha in 1925. By his early 20s in Boston and then Harlem, he was known on the street as Detroit Red, running numbers and drifting toward the criminal life that eventually landed him in prison in 1946. In prison, he encountered the teachings of the Nation of Islam, converted, and on his release adopted a new name, Malcolm X. The X standing in for the African family name slavery had erased. Over the following decade, he became one of the most recognizable and forceful voices in Black America, a minister and organizer whose rhetoric reshaped how an entire movement talked about race and power in the country. Then, in 1964, after a pilgrimage to Mecca and a break with the Nation of Islam, he changed again, adopting the name El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, and returning from that pilgrimage with a substantially revised view of the racial framework he'd spent years preaching, one shaped by having prayed alongside Muslims of every race during the Hajj. He was assassinated the following year, in February 1965, having lived, in less than 2 decades, through 3 distinct public identities, each built on the version of himself that came before it, and each, in its own way, a genuine transformation rather than a costume. What makes this case different from simple reputation management is that each reinvention appears, from the historical record, to have reflected a real internal shift rather than a calculated rebrand. Malcolm's changes tracked new experience and conviction, not merely new strategy. That distinction matters. A reinvention built entirely on image, with nothing underneath it actually changing, tends to be recognized eventually as exactly that, a costume. The reinventions that hold are usually the ones where the person underneath actually became someone new, and the new name was simply catching up to what had already happened. Law 26. Keep your hands clean. In December 1170, 4 knights arrived at Canterbury Cathedral and killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in front of the altar. The knights believed they were acting on the wishes of King Henry II, who had reportedly erupted in frustration over his long conflict with Becket, with some version of the words later remembered as, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The precise wording is disputed by historians, and whether Henry meant it as a literal command or simply an outburst of temper has never been settled with certainty. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The murder caused immediate, widespread outrage across Christian Europe, and Henry, facing the real possibility of excommunication and a collapse of his authority, publicly distanced himself from the killing. He did public penance at Becket's tomb, walking barefoot through Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by monks as an act of contrition, and insisted then and afterward that he had never actually ordered the murder. Whatever Henry's private intentions had been, the conflict with Becket that had consumed years of his reign was, after the murder, effectively over, resolved in Henry's favor in every practical sense that mattered, while Henry himself stood publicly, visibly, on the side of grief rather than triumph. The knights bore the blame. The king kept the outcome. The distance between wanting an outcome and being seen to cause it is, in almost every hierarchy, where real protection lives. A leader whose wishes are carried out by subordinates, without an explicit order ever being traceable back to them, gets the benefit of the result without the exposure of the decision, which is precisely why so many instructions in organizations, historically and now, are given in language vague enough to be denied later. This isn't a lesson in how to avoid responsibility. It's a lesson in how responsibility can be deliberately obscured and in what it means, watching from below, when the language above you turns suddenly vague right before something irreversible happens. Law 27. Play on people's need to believe. In 1920, a woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after a suicide attempt and spent years in psychiatric institutions before eventually claiming, in the mid-1920s, to be Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Russia's last Tsar, believed to have been executed with the rest of her family in 1918. The claim spread widely. Surviving relatives and former acquaintances of the Romanov family were divided. Some recognized details in Anna Anderson, as she came to be known, that convinced them she truly was Anastasia, while others dismissed her immediately as an obvious fraud. The dispute over her identity ran for decades through lawsuits, books, and public fascination that outlasted Anderson's own life. She died in 1984, still maintaining the claim. DNA testing conducted after her death, using preserved tissue samples, ultimately established that Anna Anderson was almost certainly a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, with no genetic relation to the Romanovs at all. What kept the claim alive for 60 years wasn't strong evidence. Contemporaries who examined the case closely found the physical and factual discrepancies significant even at the time. What kept it alive was that a surviving Romanov daughter, against impossible odds, was a story people wanted to be true. A European royal family that hadn't been entirely extinguished, a single thread of continuity surviving catastrophe. The need to believe a story doesn't require the story to be well supported. It only requires the story to be one people would rather have than the alternative. Law 28. Enter action with boldness. In January of 49 BC, Julius Caesar led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary marking the edge of Roman Italy, in open defiance of the Senate's order that he disband his army before returning to Rome. Roman law was unambiguous about what he was doing. A general entering Italy proper at the head of an army was, by definition, committing an act of war against the Republic itself. There was no version of this decision that could later be quietly walked back or reframed as a misunderstanding. Caesar understood that as clearly as anyone. The phrase later attributed to him at the crossing, "the die is cast," may or may not be authentic to the moment, but it captures accurately what the act itself represented, a decision with no available retreat. Caesar's boldness worked partly because hesitation, in his specific circumstance, carried its own certain cost. He faced prosecution and political ruin the moment his command ended if he returned to Rome as a private citizen. The civil war that followed the crossing was, in that light, less a reckless gamble than the only path that offered any chance of survival at all. Pompey and much of the Senate, expecting Caesar to negotiate or hesitate, weren't prepared for a general who moved before they'd finished deciding how to respond to him. Boldness of this kind isn't a virtue independent of circumstance. It worked for Caesar because the alternative was worse, and because his opponents' hesitation gave him time an equally decisive response would have denied him. The same act, launched from a weaker position or against a faster opponent, has ended careers instead of building empires. Law 29. Plan all the way to the end. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812 began as the largest military campaign Europe had ever seen, over 400,000 soldiers crossing into Russian territory, a force built to overwhelm any army that stood against it. The opening phases went according to plan. Napoleon pushed deep into Russian territory, won at Borodino in September, and occupied Moscow itself. Moscow was empty. Much of it was already burning, set alight by its own retreating population, and no Russian government came to negotiate. Napoleon had planned an invasion. He had not planned for a capital with nobody left inside it to surrender. The retreat began in October. Of the roughly 400,000 to 600,000 soldiers who had crossed into Russia that summer, historians' estimates of the original force vary. Only a small fraction made it back. Cold, starvation, and hundreds of miles of fighting retreat did the rest. Napoleon had planned the invasion with extraordinary logistical detail. What he hadn't planned was what victory would actually require next. Taking Moscow turned out to be a goal that, once achieved, offered no clear path forward at all. A campaign built entirely around reaching an objective, without a plan for what happens once you're standing there, isn't really a complete plan. It's an opening move mistaken for an ending. Law 30. Make your accomplishments seem effortless. Michelangelo spent roughly 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, working largely alone on scaffolding of his own design, in a position that left him with lasting physical damage to his neck and eyes, by most accounts of the toll the project took on him. The finished work reads, to almost anyone who sees it, as something closer to inevitability than labor, figures that seem to have simply arrived fully formed rather than been fought for, revised, and physically endured over 4 punishing years. Michelangelo's own letters from the period tell a different story. Complaints about the working conditions, the strain, and at points open frustration with a commission he had initially resisted taking at all, having considered himself primarily a sculptor rather than a painter. None of that struggle is visible in the ceiling itself. What survives is the appearance of ease, and that appearance is, in its own way, as much a part of the achievement as the technical skill involved. A viewer standing beneath the ceiling isn't meant to see 4 years of physical suffering. They're meant to see something that looks like it couldn't have been made any other way. This is close to the opposite of how most people instinctively want to be seen. The instinct is often to display the effort, to make sure everyone understands how hard the work was. But effort, once it's visible, changes how an accomplishment is read. Visible strain suggests the outcome was in doubt. That skill alone wasn't enough. What Michelangelo left behind suggests the opposite, whether or not that was ever fully true. Law 31. Control the options. Cardinal John Morton, serving as Lord Chancellor under England's Henry VII in the late 15th century, is remembered today for a piece of fiscal reasoning that later generations nicknamed Morton's Fork. Tasked with raising money for the crown, Morton reportedly reasoned that any nobleman living visibly well must have money to spare and could therefore afford to contribute generously to the king's coffers, while any nobleman living modestly and frugally must, by the same logic, have accumulated savings over the years and could therefore also afford to contribute generously. Wealth displayed proved the capacity to pay. Wealth withheld proved it just as effectively. There was, by design, no answer available that avoided the conclusion Morton had already decided on. Whether Morton actually applied this reasoning as systematically as the later legend suggests is a matter some historians treat with real skepticism. Much of what's remembered about the fork comes down through accounts written after his death, but the phrase endured precisely because the logic it describes is recognizable everywhere, regardless of how literally the original story happened. A negotiation, a performance review, an interrogation structured around 2 or 3 choices that all lead to the same outcome isn't really offering a choice at all. It's offering the appearance of one, which is often more effective than removing choice altogether, because people tend to defend decisions they believe they made freely, even when every option available led to the same place. Law 32. Play to people's fantasies. In the autumn of 1720, the price of shares in the South Sea Company, a British trading enterprise with a modest and largely unprofitable actual business exporting goods to South America, had risen roughly tenfold in less than a year, driven almost entirely by speculation, rather than anything resembling the company's real earnings. What the company was selling, in practice, wasn't trade revenue. It was a story about the future, vague promises of enormous, unspecified wealth from South American markets that the company's charter gave it exclusive rights to, at a moment when English investors, watching fortunes apparently being made overnight, were eager to believe almost anything that let them participate. Smaller, more openly speculative companies sprang up alongside the South Sea Company itself, some with business plans so undefined that one, according to a widely repeated account from the period, offered shares in, quote, a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, and reportedly sold out within hours regardless. The bubble collapsed by the end of 1720, wiping out fortunes across English society, including, by most accounts, a significant portion of Isaac Newton's own savings, leading to a remark attributed to him that he could calculate the motion of the heavens, but not the madness of men. What drove the South Sea bubble wasn't ignorance of risk in any simple sense. Contemporary accounts make clear that plenty of investors understood, at some level, how thin the underlying business actually was. What drove it was the appeal of a story that offered exactly what people already wanted to believe was possible. And a story built around what an audience already longs for tends to survive a great deal of scrutiny that a plainer, more honest pitch never could. A story built around what an audience already longs for tends to survive a great deal of scrutiny that a plainer, more honest pitch never could. That's a dangerous thing to know about people, and the next stretch of this documentary spends more time than any other on exactly how dangerous. Movement 5. Reading human weakness. A warning before this section starts. Several of the laws that follow describe, in plain terms, how manipulation works, how insecurity, desire, and fear get identified and used against people. That material is included here for one reason, and it isn't to teach anyone how to run these tactics on someone else. It's so the mechanism becomes recognizable from the other side of it. So a listener who feels a version of this happening to them or to someone they care about has language for what they're seeing before it goes any further. Law 33. Discover each person's weak point. Grigory Rasputin's influence over the Russian imperial family in the years before the revolution has been explained many different ways, as spiritual charisma, as simple opportunism, as a kind of hypnotic personal presence contemporaries struggled to describe. But the documented core of it is narrower and more specific than any of those explanations. Tsarina Alexandra's son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even minor injuries potentially fatal, and that the imperial family kept largely hidden from the Russian public. Rasputin appeared at moments when the boy's condition worsened, to calm him, and by several contemporary accounts, ease his suffering when court physicians could not. Whatever the actual explanation for those episodes, and historians have proposed everything from a calming psychological presence to simple coincidence in the timing of Alexei's flare-ups, the effect on Alexandra was total. Her fear for her son's life had found, in Rasputin, something that felt like relief, and that single point of desperate need became the foundation for an influence over the royal family that extended into political appointments and court decisions far beyond anything related to Alexei's health. What this illustrates isn't a technique worth learning. It's a pattern worth recognizing. Influence built on a person's deepest fear or need doesn't require broad charisma or general trustworthiness. It requires finding the one place someone feels most exposed and becoming the answer to it. That's precisely why it's so hard to see from the inside. The person being influenced isn't evaluating the manipulator's character in general. They're just grateful, in a moment of real fear, that someone showed up. Law 34. Be royal in your own fashion. Act like a king to be treated like one. Frederick Douglass spent the first 20 years of his life enslaved in Maryland and the rest of it as one of the most formidable public figures in 19th century America, an author, orator, and statesman whose personal bearing was, by nearly every account from people who met him, impossible to separate from the force of his arguments. Douglass wrote in his own narratives about the specific moment he identified as the turning point in how he carried himself. A physical confrontation with an overseer named Edward Covey, hired specifically to break enslaved people through brutal labor and punishment. Douglass fought back, refusing to be beaten that day, and later described the encounter as the moment he stopped experiencing himself as someone who could be treated as less than a man. A shift in self-regard that preceded, by years, his actual escape from slavery. That self-regard became visible in everything that followed. Contemporaries, including political opponents, frequently remarked on Douglass's commanding physical presence and manner of speaking. A dignity that white audiences of the period, conditioned by the racist assumptions of the era, often found disorienting precisely because it demanded a kind of respect that the surrounding society insisted people like Douglass weren't entitled to. This is a different mechanism than most of the laws in this section and worth separating clearly from them. Douglass didn't manufacture an image to manipulate anyone. He simply refused to accept the diminished view of himself that an entire society was trying to impose, and that refusal, sustained consistently, changed how people around him behaved, because most people take their cue for how to treat someone from how that person appears to regard themselves. Law 35. Master the art of timing. The Allied invasion of Normandy, planned for early June 1944, depended on a narrow combination of conditions: a specific range of tides that would expose beach obstacles for demolition teams, enough moonlight for airborne troops to navigate by night, and calm enough seas for a landing craft crossing to be survivable at all. Only a handful of days each month satisfied every requirement simultaneously. The original target date, June 5th, was postponed at the last possible moment when a storm moved through the English Channel. Allied meteorologists, working with data the Germans didn't have access to in the same detail, identified a narrow break in the weather for June 6th, good enough to proceed, though still far from ideal conditions. General Eisenhower made the call to launch on that narrower, less certain window, rather than wait for the next full alignment of tide and moon weeks later, judging that a longer delay risked the secrecy of the entire operation more than the marginal weather did. German commanders, watching the same rough weather Eisenhower's forces launched into, had concluded an invasion in those conditions was unlikely. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was away from his post that weekend, confident enough in the forecast to be visiting his family in Germany. The invasion succeeded partly because it arrived at the exact moment the defending side had judged least probable. The same decision, launched a day earlier into the worst storm, or delayed weeks for better conditions and lost secrecy, could easily have failed for entirely different reasons. Correct timing isn't only about identifying the ideal moment. It's about recognizing the best available moment inside constraints that never offer anything close to ideal. Law 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. According to the account most often repeated by ancient historians, Alexander the Great, visiting Corinth at the height of his power, sought out the philosopher Diogenes, who was living by choice in extreme poverty, largely rejecting the possessions and comforts most people spent their lives pursuing. Alexander reportedly offered to grant Diogenes anything he wished. Diogenes, the story goes, asked only that Alexander move slightly to one side. He was blocking the sunlight. Alexander is said to have remarked afterward that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. The story survives in several ancient sources, with enough variation between them that historians treat the exact wording as legend rather than verified history, the kind of anecdote later writers shape to make a philosophical point as much as record an event. But the point it was shaped to make has outlasted the uncertainty about its accuracy. Diogenes had nothing Alexander could dangle in front of him, because he had already decided he wanted none of it. That refusal, genuine, not performed for effect, left Alexander with no leverage at all over a man who owned almost nothing. Wanting something gives whoever controls it power over you, whether that something is money, status, or another person's approval. The absence of that want is difficult to manufacture convincingly if it isn't real, which is exactly why the story treats Diogenes' indifference as remarkable rather than replicable. Pretending not to want something you actually want rarely survives contact with the person testing whether you mean it. Law 37. Create compelling spectacles. On December 2, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French in a ceremony that broke from centuries of coronation tradition in one deliberate, widely noted detail. At the moment of crowning, Napoleon took the crown from Pope Pius VII's hands and placed it on his own head himself. The gesture wasn't a slight against the church, so much as a precisely engineered statement about the source of his authority. Every prior European coronation of this kind had positioned the monarch as receiving legitimacy from a higher power, delivered through the Pope's hands. Napoleon's self-crowning, recorded in Jacques-Louis David's famous painting of the event, though David's version notably softened the moment, showing Napoleon crowning Josephine rather than the more provocative instant of self-coronation, announced instead that his authority originated in himself, in what he had already built and won, with the church's presence serving as ceremony rather than source. The spectacle worked because it compressed an entire political argument into a single, unmistakable physical gesture, one that required no explanation to any observer, regardless of language or literacy. A treaty or proclamation makes an argument in words that can be debated. A crown placed by one's own hands, in front of the assembled powers of Europe, makes an argument that doesn't invite debate at all. It simply exists, and everyone watching has to react to it as a fact rather than a claim. Law 38. Think as you like, but behave like others. In June 1633, Galileo Galilei knelt before the Roman Inquisition and formally recanted his support for the Copernican view that the Earth orbits the Sun, a position the Church had judged heretical, contrary to Scripture as officially interpreted at the time. Galileo had spent decades building the observational case for exactly the view he was now being made to disavow in public, under threat of imprisonment, or worse. The recantation was total and explicit. Privately, his convictions almost certainly hadn't changed at all. The phrase later attached to the moment, that the Earth still moves regardless of what he'd just sworn, is almost certainly a later invention, rather than something Galileo actually said, or even could have safely muttered in that room. But the sentiment attributed to him captures something true about the situation, even if the words themselves are legend. Recanting publicly and abandoning a conclusion privately are not the same act, and the historical record of Galileo's later, quieter writing suggests he never actually abandoned the latter. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, but alive, and continued scientific work in the years that remained to him, including a major treatise completed under those restricted conditions. Open defiance, in his specific circumstances, would very likely have ended that work, and possibly his life, without changing the astronomical facts in the slightest. Outward conformity, held alongside a private conviction that never actually bends, is a survival strategy rather than a surrender, though it's one that depends entirely on the private conviction staying intact underneath the performance. The danger the law doesn't advertise is how easily years of performed agreement can quietly become real agreement, simply through repetition, if the person underneath isn't deliberately holding on to what they actually believe. Law 39, stir up waters to catch fish, use anger to provoke. In July 1870, Otto von Bismarck released an edited version of a telegram, the EMS Dispatch, describing an exchange between the Prussian king and the French ambassador. Bismarck's edit, trimming the original wording without technically fabricating anything in it, made the exchange read as considerably more dismissive and insulting to France than the original telegram had actually been. Published in French newspapers, the edited version produced exactly the public outrage Bismarck appears to have anticipated. Within days, France, its public opinion inflamed by an insult that had been deliberately sharpened before it ever reached them, declared war on Prussia. A war that Prussia, having spent years preparing militarily and diplomatically for exactly this confrontation, was considerably better positioned to win than France was, and did win decisively within months. Bismarck later wrote about the episode with something close to satisfaction, treating the edited telegram less as a diplomatic incident than as a calculated instrument. A small, precise provocation released at a moment when France's own wounded pride did the rest of the work without any further intervention required. The mechanism matters more than the specific history. A provoked opponent, reacting from anger rather than calculation, tends to act against their own actual interests, and someone positioned to benefit from that overreaction doesn't need to force the mistake directly. They only need to supply the spark and let the other side's own emotional response do the damage. Recognizing this pattern, a small, sharpened insult arriving at a suspiciously convenient moment is the clearest defense against it that exists. Law 40, despise the free lunch. By the mid-1520s, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII, had built one of the most magnificent private residences in England at Hampton Court, grander by most accounts of visitors at the time than any of the king's own palaces. Sensing, correctly, that a subject's home outshining the monarch's was not a safe position to hold for long. Echoing, though Wolsey likely never framed it this way himself, exactly the danger Fouquet would later fail to avoid at Vaux, Wolsey offered Hampton Court to Henry as a gift, reportedly framing it as evidence of loyal devotion rather than acknowledgement of the risk. Henry accepted the palace. He did not, however, treat the gift as a settled transaction that closed the matter. Hampton Court became, over the following years, one of Henry's favorite residences, expanded extensively under his own direction, and Wolsey's broader position at court continued to erode regardless of the gift, culminating in his fall from royal favor in 1529 over his failure to secure the king's desired annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The palace hadn't purchased the security it was meant to buy. If anything, it had confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how much Wolsey had that Henry might eventually decide to take. A gift offered to diffuse a dangerous situation doesn't necessarily diffuse it. Sometimes it only demonstrates, in concrete form, precisely how much the giver has to lose, turning a vague suspicion of excessive wealth or standing into an itemized, undeniable inventory of it. The lunch that appears free rarely stays that way once the person receiving it starts wondering what else might be available for the taking. Wolsey isn't the last person in this story who will try to buy safety with a gesture of generosity and find out afterward that it bought the opposite. Movement 6. The decline of power. Almost nobody in this documentary so far has lost their position through a single obvious mistake. Fouquet's party, Ceausescu's isolation, Napoleon's occupation of an empty Moscow. In nearly every case, the fall was seeded by something that had, at some earlier point, actually worked. Success has a way of teaching people the wrong lesson at exactly the moment they most need the right one. That the approach which built their position will go on working indefinitely in every new situation without adjustment. The final 8 laws are mostly about that specific failure. The moment winning starts to look, to the person doing it, like something closer to a law of nature than a temporary condition that circumstances could still take away. Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Tiberius became emperor of Rome in the year 14 AD, succeeding Augustus. A man who had ended a century of civil war, reshaped Rome's entire system of government, and ruled for over 4 decades with a level of authority and popular association that bordered on the sacred by the time of his death. Tiberius was, by most historians' assessment, a genuinely capable administrator and general in his own right. What he wasn't, and what no successor to Augustus realistically could have been, was Augustus, and the comparison followed him for the entirety of his reign, regardless of his actual competence. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, portrayed Tiberius as increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and resentful of a Senate that seemed, in his reading of it, to measure every decision against a predecessor Tiberius could never fully escape. By 26 AD, Tiberius had left Rome entirely, retreating to the island of Capri. For the final decade of his rule, governing the empire at a physical distance he apparently found more bearable than the daily comparison waiting for him in the capital. Whether the withdrawal reflected genuine paranoia, simple exhaustion with court politics, or something else entirely is a matter later historians read differently. Tacitus wrote with an obvious hostility toward Tiberius that modern historians treat with some caution. But the underlying bind is documented clearly enough, regardless of Tacitus's specific bias. A successor inheriting a legendary figure's position rarely gets evaluated on their own record. They get evaluated against a version of the predecessor that has, by the time of the comparison, already been smoothed by memory into something no living person could match. Law 42. Strike the shepherd. By 1864, the Taiping Rebellion had consumed over a decade of civil war in Qing China, led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service examination candidate who came to believe, following a period of illness and visions, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, tasked with establishing a new religious and political order across China. At its height, the movement he built controlled large portions of southern China and commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Hong died in June 1864 during the final siege of the movement's capital at Nanjing, by most accounts from illness, though some sources from the period suggested other causes. Within weeks of his death, the city fell to Qing imperial forces, and the rebellion that had sustained itself for over a decade against China's ruling dynasty collapsed with a speed that surprised even the imperial commanders, who had spent years failing to defeat it through conventional military pressure. The movement had depended, in ways that became fully visible only after his death, on Hong's specific religious authority holding together factions, generals, and territories that had few other reasons to remain unified once the figure claiming divine sanction for the whole enterprise was no longer there to provide it. Estimates of the total death toll from the Taiping Rebellion, from fighting, famine, and disease across its full course, run into the tens of millions, making it among the deadliest conflicts in human history, and its ending illustrates something grimmer than a simple tactical lesson. An organization built entirely around one figure's personal authority doesn't merely weaken when that figure is removed. It can cease to function as a coherent structure almost overnight. Law 43. Work on the hearts and minds of others. Around 261 BC, the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka led a military campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga that resulted, by his own later account carved into rock edicts across his empire, in the deaths of over 100,000 people and the deportation of many more. What makes Ashoka's story unusual isn't the conquest. Brutal military campaigns were common enough among ancient empires. It's what he did afterward. Ashoka's own inscriptions describe a documented change in his approach to rule following Kalinga, one he attributed explicitly to remorse over the scale of suffering the war had caused. In the decades that followed, he pursued an empire held together increasingly through the promotion of Dhamma, a program of ethical governance, religious tolerance, public works, and moral instruction spread through edicts inscribed on pillars and rock faces across the subcontinent, rather than primarily through military garrison and force. Ashoka didn't disarm his empire. Mauryan military strength remained a real factor throughout his reign, but the emphasis of his rule shifted visibly toward persuasion, welfare projects, and a public moral vocabulary that asked to be believed in, not merely obeyed, an approach that later Buddhist tradition would remember, with some idealization built into the memory, as one of history's rare examples of a conqueror attempting to rule through legitimacy rather than fear alone. The limitation is built into the story as clearly as the achievement. This shift was possible partly because Ashoka's empire, by the time of Kalinga, was already the dominant power on the subcontinent, with little immediate external threat requiring pure military deterrence. Ruling through hearts and minds is easier to sustain from a position of established strength than it is to establish in the first place, against rivals who haven't yet been persuaded to stop testing you by force. Law 44, disarmed through the mirror effect. In October 1974, in Kinshasa, Zaire, Muhammad Ali faced George Foreman for the heavyweight championship of the world, a fight nearly every observer expected Ali to lose. Foreman was younger, significantly harder hitting, and had knocked out two opponents who had themselves beaten Ali in previous fights. Ali's strategy, developed largely in the ring itself as the fight unfolded rather than announced beforehand, became known afterward as the rope-a-dope. Rather than meeting Foreman's power directly or trying to outmaneuver it with speed, Ali leaned back against the ropes and allowed Foreman to throw punch after punch, absorbing the impact on his arms and body while offering minimal resistance, essentially letting Foreman's own force be the thing that wore Foreman down, round after round, in the tropical heat, without Ali needing to generate comparable power of his own. By the 8th round, Foreman, having thrown enormous energy into punches that had produced no decisive effect, was visibly exhausted. Ali, who had absorbed the punishment rather than escalated against it, knocked him out. Foreman's greatest weapon, his overwhelming punching power, had been turned into the mechanism of his own exhaustion, simply by giving it nowhere decisive to land and no reason to stop being used. An opponent's own intensity, offered no resistance sharp enough to justify pulling back, will frequently spend itself faster than a direct confrontation ever could, a lesson that applies to arguments and negotiations at least as often as it applies to boxing. Law 45, preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, launched in 1933 in response to the Great Depression, is often remembered as a single sweeping transformation of the American economy. It wasn't delivered that way. It arrived instead as a long sequence of distinct programs, agencies, and legislative acts. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, Social Security, banking reform, introduced across years rather than all at once, each tested, adjusted, and in some cases abandoned or struck down by the courts before the next wave followed. Roosevelt's own rhetoric leaned constantly on continuity, even while the substance of what he was proposing represented a genuine expansion of federal government's role in American economic life, invoking traditional American values and incremental experimentation, rather than framing the New Deal as the wholesale reinvention it substantially was. Programs were introduced, evaluated, and either expanded or quietly retired based on results and political feasibility, an approach that let the overall project continue adjusting course across nearly a decade rather than standing or falling on a single package passed in a single legislative session. The pacing wasn't purely a matter of political caution, though caution was certainly part of it. A public and a Congress unfamiliar with this scale of federal intervention were, by most historical accounts, more willing to accept it delivered in digestible pieces than as a single transformative demand. Reform introduced gradually gives institutions and public opinion time to adjust without triggering the kind of concentrated resistance that a single sweeping change tends to provoke all at once, simply by giving opponents one moment rather than many smaller ones at which to mobilize against it. Law 46, never appear too perfect. Aristides, an Athenian statesman of the early 5th century BC, was known widely enough for his fairness and integrity that he came to be called by his contemporaries Aristides the Just. According to Plutarch's account, Written centuries later, an illiterate citizen approached Aristides during a vote of ostracism, a procedure by which Athenians could banish a citizen for 10 years by writing his name on a shard of pottery, and, not recognizing him, asked him to write the name Aristides on his own shard. When Aristides asked why, the citizen reportedly answered that he was simply tired of hearing him called the just everywhere he went. Aristides, the story goes, wrote his own name without protest and was duly ostracized. Historians treat this specific anecdote with some caution, as Plutarch was writing several centuries after the events he described, and drawing on sources that had already had time to shape the story into something more instructive than strictly documented. But the pattern it illustrates shows up in less colorful, better documented forms constantly. A reputation for flawlessness doesn't only invite admiration. Sustained over time, it invites a specific, corrosive fatigue in people who have to keep hearing about it, one that has nothing to do with whether the reputation is deserved, and everything to do with how exhausting it becomes to stand permanently in comparison to it. Law 47. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, ended the First World War with terms harsher than the war itself required to end. That's not a modern judgment. British economist John Maynard Keynes, sitting inside the British delegation at the time, resigned in protest and said so in print within months. Germany's military had already collapsed by late 1918. The armistice had already secured the practical victory the Allies needed. Everything the treaty added after that, the reparations, the territorial losses, the formal assignment of war guilt, was extracted from a war already won, not required to win it. Whether those harsher terms actually caused what came 2 decades later is a question historians still argue about. The Great Depression and other forces get equal weight in most serious accounts, and the line from Versailles to 1939 is not as straight as it's sometimes drawn. But the narrower point holds regardless. A victory secured is a different question from how far to press it once it's already won. Keynes's specific warning was that pressing further would turn a clean victory into a grievance the losing side spends years working to reverse. Law 48. Assume formlessness. Bruce Lee, in developing the martial art he called Jeet Kune Do during the late 1960s, rejected something that most established martial arts traditions of the time treated as fundamental: a fixed system of forms, styles, and prescribed responses meant to be mastered and then applied. Lee's own writing on the subject, later collected and published posthumously, argued that rigid adherence to any single style eventually becomes a limitation rather than a strength. A practitioner trained exclusively in one tradition's assumptions becomes predictable to anyone who has studied that tradition and unprepared for anything genuinely outside it. His alternative wasn't a new fixed style to replace the old ones. It was closer to a deliberate refusal to have a fixed style at all, absorbing whatever proved useful from wherever it came, discarding whatever didn't work regardless of its traditional pedigree, and staying continuously responsive to whatever an opponent actually presented rather than to what training had prepared for in the abstract. Be water, the phrase most closely associated with Lee's philosophy, describes water's specific property of taking the exact shape of whatever contains it, offering no fixed form for an opponent to study, predict, or exploit in advance. This is a different note to end on than most of what's come before in this documentary, and that difference is deliberate. Formlessness, as Lee described it, isn't concealment for the sake of advantage over someone else. It's the discipline of staying genuinely responsive to new information, new circumstances, new opponents, rather than defending a fixed identity or method simply because it worked once before. Nearly everyone examined across the previous 47 laws eventually failed at exactly this. They found an approach that worked, and then kept using it past the point where the world around them had already changed. Final chapter: what is left after the laws? Step back for a moment from all 48 of them. Imagine actually living this way, treating every relationship, every conversation, every kindness someone offers you as a move in a longer contest for position. Not occasionally as a tool reached for in a genuine crisis, but constantly as the default lens for reading other people. The historical record gives some sense of what that costs. Ivan the Terrible ended his reign isolated, having killed or exiled much of the nobility he might otherwise have relied on, in a fit of rage said to have also killed his own son. Tiberius died on Capri, having spent his final decade unable to return to the city he ruled. Wei Zongxian, having built a position entirely on one emperor's curiosity, took his own life within months of that emperor's death. None of these were people who lacked skill at the game. They were, by the standards the game itself sets, remarkably good at it. What they lost wasn't the contest. It was almost everything the contest was supposedly being fought to protect. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that seems to come from permanent calculation. A state in which every compliment prompts the question of what it's really for. Every act of generosity gets quietly filed as a debt someone will eventually call in. Every relationship gets evaluated for its strategic value before it's allowed to simply exist. Kindness, read this way, stops being something a person can receive. It becomes something they have to solve. It's worth naming, plainly, that there appear to be at least 3 different things people mean when they talk about power, and this documentary has mostly been describing only one of them. Power over people is the kind built through pressure, fear, dependence, manufactured scarcity, and status games. It's the power in Rasputin's grip on a frightened mother, in Wei Zongxian's control of an idle emperor's mail, in Bismarck's edited telegram. It can be extraordinarily effective in the short term. It also tends to require constant maintenance, because it survives only as long as the fear, dependence, or deception underneath it stays intact, and history is full of examples of exactly how fast that underneath can give way. Power with people is a different thing almost entirely, built through trust, competence, shared purpose, and the kind of reliability that doesn't need to be manufactured because it's simply true over enough repeated instances. It's harder to build, it moves slower, it rarely produces a single dramatic turning point worth putting in a documentary. But it tends to survive the departure of any one person holding it, because it was never actually dependent on that person's continued manipulation to keep functioning. Power over oneself may be the least discussed of the 3, and the hardest to dramatize because it mostly looks like nothing happening. It's Frederick Douglass refusing to accept a diminished view of his own worth, regardless of what the world around him insisted. It's Galileo holding a private conviction intact underneath a forced public recantation. It's the discipline, examined across several of these laws, of not needing every room to confirm your importance before you can feel secure in it. The 48 laws this documentary is walked through are mostly maps of the first kind of power, occasionally intersecting with the second, and rarely addressing the third at all, which may be the most honest criticism available of the book they came from. It's an extraordinarily useful field guide to how power over people has actually operated across 5 centuries of recorded history. It has much less to say about the kind of power that doesn't require anyone else to become smaller for you to become secure. None of this is an argument that the laws are worthless, or that studying them is itself a moral failing. Recognizing manipulation is not the same act as practicing it, and several of the people examined in this documentary, Douglass, Ahsoka after Kalinga, arguably Galileo, used a genuine understanding of how power operates, specifically to protect themselves or others from being controlled by it. Understanding the mechanism is not optional if the goal is to avoid being run by it. But it's worth asking, having spent this long inside the framework, what the win actually looks like if you play it all the way through. Wolsey lost his position despite, or because of, a gift meant to secure it. Napoleon took an empty city and lost 500,000 men finding out what taking it actually cost. Almost nobody in this history got to keep what the game seemed, in the moment, to be offering them. Go back to where this documentary started. Fouquet built the most magnificent evening France had ever seen, because he wanted the most powerful man in the country to walk out of it admiring him. Louis walked out of it instead deciding that no subject would ever again be allowed to make him feel that way. Neither man got what he actually wanted. Fouquet wanted a room full of admiration. He ended up in a cell. Louis wanted a kingdom that could never again upstage him, and spent the rest of his reign building an entire palace to make sure of it, which meant he spent the rest of his reign still needing the room to tell him he mattered, just on a grander and more expensive scale than before. Maybe the more durable form of power was never about controlling how a room sees you. Maybe it was always about being able to walk into that room, any room, full of ambition, rivalry, flattery, and threat, without needing it to hand you anything at all in order to feel like yourself. That isn't a law. It doesn't come with a historical case attached to prove it works. Fouquet never got there. It's worth wondering whether Louis, for all he built, ever did either. It's just the question everyone in this documentary eventually had to answer, one way or another, whether they meant to or not.